Hi, everyone. My name is Masu Haque-Khan. I'm a 1995 Yale College graduate. I was in JE. JE sucks. And I'm an employment lawyer, career counselor, writer, and advocate. As part of the 150th anniversary of Women at Yale, I am so pleased and so honored to be here with my dear friend, the amazing Congresswoman Katie Porter, Yale class of 1996. Katie is serving her first term in Congress as the U.S. representative for California's 45th Congressional District, and she's up for re-election this November. She is also a single mom to 3 awesome kids, Luke, Paul, and Betsy. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. It's so great to do this with you, Masu.
I know, it's so fun. There is so much that people want to hear your views on that it's hard to know where to begin, but I think we'll just start with your top of mind concerns. You're one of the few public figures that we've come to associate with positive impact and action during a time when our nation faces overwhelming problems. The coronavirus, climate change, threats to democracy, problems stemming from staggering racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequity, the breakdown of fair and functioning immigration and naturalization system, just to name a few of the many.
Way to start it out on a lighthearted note. Way to open it up with some nice fluff questions.
Well,
let's just dig into all the problems in the world. And let's hear what you're going to ask me here.
What I'm going to ask you is, out of all of these problems, which are top of mind for you these days as a congresswoman, and what can and should be done to address them?
Yeah, so I'm not going to swing at what can and should be done to address all of the world's problems. But I will say, I think one of the things about Congress that I didn't appreciate until I got there was that we are not short on problems in this country. What we are short on are solutions. And so I've tried to pick issues where I feel like there's really a need. There is a path forward and just nobody is prioritizing it. And so one of the areas that I've been working on a lot that I think fits into this category is mental health. So we have a really broken healthcare system. The mental health component of it is particularly troubled. People who have insurance discover that, in fact, as a practical matter, they don't really have mental health coverage due to the very limited number of providers who take insurance, incredibly low reimbursement rates, limited provider networks, and things like that. So this is part of both. When we say defend the Affordable Care Act, we also have to acknowledge that we have to be willing to be clear-eyed about where we need to improve the Affordable Care Act. So 10 years ago, we promised the American people parity, that physical health and mental health would be treated the same. And we failed to deliver on that. So this was something I was really interested in before the pandemic, but like so many things, I think this pandemic is highlighting the need for broad-based behavioral health availability. We see it in seniors who are dealing with isolation. We see it with students who are dealing, young kids who are dealing with fear about their parents getting sick, essential workers who are traumatized. And so I also have a bill to work on increasing funding for mental health during the pandemic, and it's given one of these very clever names, Stopping the Mental Health Pandemic Act. And then I also have a bill working on students and mental health, which I think is something that when we were in college in the early 90s, we were just starting to see campuses really grapple with this. But how can we help support students who are facing mental health challenges in college to be able to stay on campus, get help and treatment, and graduate successfully? And so sort of thinking about how we do those things. So that's a big area that I've been working on. And it's one where there's so much bipartisan support that this is one of those problems where if we can't make progress on some of this stuff where we have a lot of bipartisan support, how do we ever build forward to push on harder issues like the exorbitant price of prescription drugs, for example?
Yes. Okay, that's great. So Katie, you just mentioned how the pandemic has worsened mental health issues. The pandemic has really had a dramatically negative effect on so many things, but I want to focus a little bit on your thoughts on the pandemic's impact on working mothers. So as most of us know, you're the only single mom in Congress, And as your friend, I know that even before the pandemic, it was a stretch for you to find enough time to do your work and family obligations in sort of that full-on Hallmark, amazing Katie Porter fashion that we're used to. So you mentioned in a May Atlantic article that since the big pandemic began, in March, you've gone from working 6 to 17 hours a day to 18 to 19 hours a day. And I will be honest, it sounds really brutal and very, very hard to sustain. How are you managing to do all this? And did your days at Yale prepare you for this moment in any way?
So I think like most parents, I'm doing the best I can right now. But I think that the pandemic has highlighted again how hard it is for working parents. And this was true beforehand. And some of it is the level of expectation that we put on workers today, and the lack of support that there is. But also seeing that, for example, for me, my professional career, including but not limited to my running for Congress and being able to serve in Congress, would not be possible without a strong public school system, which I feel very fortunate to have. So as schools have closed, my kids have, I've been having to deal with more with my kids, which is a pleasure most of the time, although I do have a 14-year-old. But it's also a lot of work to do that constant juggle. And so I think as we move into jobs and work from home where there aren't such clear boundaries between being at work and not at work, the pressure becomes more and more personal to each one of us, to how do we carve out that time. And I think particularly for women, this is extra hard because of expectations in the workplace, because of concerns that you won't be seen as giving it your all, but also because I think kids' expectations from their mothers are different, and society's expectations for mothers are different. So one of the things my ex-husband used to say that I really appreciated, that he understood this, was he would say, you could be doing a great job at the park and someone will point out that your kid dropped the straw wrapper off the juice box on the ground and you did not pick it up. He's like, I could be literally paying no attention at all to these kids reading the newspaper, and I'm like a national hero for taking them to the playground. And so I do think that's part of what women feel. One of the books that I read at Yale that I've thought so much about is I read the book The Second Shift by Arlie Hochschild, about how men and women and couples divide up work and family. And what she found was that essentially, even in couples that think they're doing an equal share, women are working about twice as many hours as men. And so because I'm a single parent, it does all fall to me. And I think so much about how many single parents out there are not just in my situation of being a single parent of multiple kids, but also are working at low-income jobs, maybe are working 2 jobs, are doing shift work. So the fact that I have a job where I have to fly, where I'm out of town, where I'm gone from my kids, where my hours are unusual, that replicates actually what a lot of working families and working parents feel. And, I commented to somebody earlier today, I said, been thinking about it, and I counted 4 car dealers elected to the United States Congress and 1 single parent. And yet we live in a country where about 40 to 50% of kids are being raised in single family households. So I do think that perspective is important. In terms of what did I get from Yale, actually some of the reading that I did has been really, really important. And I mentioned one example. Some of those books I think about a lot. They really shaped how I think about the work that I'm doing. Books like Falling from Grace by Catherine Newman, some of the books on economic dislocation that I read. But I also think there's an element at Yale that's like Congress in the sense that there's so much opportunity to lead, to create community, to push forward. And yet there's still the need to sleep. There's still the need to study. There's still the need to do those basic things. And so I think that balancing act is one that I sort of got used to in college and have had to keep going ever since.
So you've just touched on this a bit, but given that this is a celebration of 150 years of women, and this is a serious matter in terms of the impact on women, the New York Times has a quote that says, the pandemic is quote unquote crushing women's careers on a global scale. Do you have thoughts on how this the situation changes, is there anything that could be done on a legislative level to assist women in helping progress in their careers and with their families concurrently?
Yeah, no, I think this is so interesting. I have open on my phone or in the New York Times app, like saved an article that says something like, in the pandemic, you can have a kid or a job, but not both. And in a great testament to sort of how hard that is, I haven't read the article and it came out like 4 months ago. But I do really think about this a lot. And, you know, I said to someone the other day, like, I'm tired. Like, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to reconcile these things. And, you know, the person said to me, you know, people are quitting their jobs over this. Like, it is nearly impossible. And I think one of the I have two pieces of thoughts on this. One is sort of very personal, I would say, to women who are dealing with kids and work, or who love or care about women who are dealing with kids and work, whether it's a sister or a family member, is this whole concept of work-family balance is one that I think we need to reframe in our head. And so when I first heard this idea of work-family balance, you know, I took fractal geometry at Yale. Like, I understood the concept of perfect symmetry. So I was like, okay, you know, it's like I have perfect work-family and they're just in harmony. Well, if that's your idea of work-family balance, you're basically doomed to be disappointed every single day. And I think the right way to think about work-family balance is more like balancing when you're riding a bike. And so you're going to hit rocks, you're going to have to pedal harder up the hills. There's going to be moments that you can coast and you're glad for them. It's okay to step off the bike and take a water break, but the basic goal is to keep on pedaling, to continue to have meaningful work or meaningful civic engagement, whatever that is, meaningful personal relationships, and be able to be a parent. So I think that's the first thing I would say to people is chuck this idea of perfect balance and substitute this kind of active balance where you're riding a bike and you understand you're going to fall over sometimes if the hurdle is big enough. And then the second thing is, I think there's just a lot more that we need to rethink in terms of how we support working parents generally, whether they're single parents or two-parent families. The reality is, and this is something that Elizabeth Warren, you know, has talked about, is that women entering professions, entering the workforce in larger numbers and staying in the workforce has actually been the major driver of our increase in GDP over the last 50 years. And so it's really, when you look at what was happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, women going to work and staying at work, often through their childbearing years as they have kids. And so how do we support that? So investing in kids, investing in childcare, it doesn't just benefit the working parents, it actually benefits our overall economy. And when you look at countries that have done things like close the gender wage gap, when you look at countries that have done things like have truly equal representation of women in boardrooms, in you know, the halls of leadership, in civic institutions, they all have one thing in common, which is major investment in childcare and understanding that as an economic building block, not just as a women's issue. And so I think that's something that we have to kind of keep pushing back on, so that every elected official should care about childcare, because every elected official, I think, would at least claim to be very interested in our country having a strong and stable economy.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Moving on to what you've become famous for, your hearing showdowns. That's our next discussion topic. It's unusual for a first-term Congresswoman to be as well known nationally as you are. And we all know that you've gone viral as a result of your insightful and effective questioning and hearings. So as a member of the House Financial Services Committee and the House Oversight and Reform Committee, you've become famous for asking tough questions of CEOs and administrative officials to hold them accountable to the American people. We've seen you masterfully question Mark Zuckerberg, Louis DeJoy, Jamie Dimon, Ben Carson, and CDC Director Robert Redfield, among others. And we're curious, who was the hardest to question, or which hearing was the toughest for you, and why? So that's the first part. And then the second part of the question is, who or what prepared you to stand up for and to others in such a fearless and effective way?
So I think the hardest witnesses to question are actually the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. And part of that is while they appear before Congress fairly often, they don't stay very long. And so we've now had 2 hearings in a row where I have not been able to question either one of them because there's just committee members who are more senior who are going ahead of me. So it's been almost a year and I haven't had a chance to question either of them. But I think part of it is they are very used to using technical terms to hide from the meaningful policy questions. And so I think it's, not allowing those two to kind of slip away by saying blah, 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 interest rates, monetary policy, blah, 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 and people tune out. The reality is these are the architects of our economy. And so we have to be asking them, what is our economic plan? What are the choices that you're going to make? Why are you making them? And so I think those are the 2 witnesses that I'd like to keep questioning because I just am such a fervent believer that capitalism requires regulators and policymakers to be engaged. Capitalism is premised on things like consumer protection, things like antitrust enforcement, things like transparency and information, low barriers to competition, all of these things. We don't always have those preconditions, which means we don't always have healthy, stable capitalism. In terms of how I prepared for this, I mean, some of it I think comes from having been a professor and asking, a law professor in particular, where I use the Socratic method. And so I'll call on all of my goal is to call on almost all of my students every single day. And so I got used to having to ask pretty short questions. And so I think, some of my students didn't give correct answers. So in that sense, they were really good preparation for some Trump administration officials where they're saying wrong things and you have to hold them to account. But some of it also comes from being a mom. I think we've all had that experience where you ask your kid, did you brush your teeth? And they didn't, right? And so when they say, uh-huh, like you have to have that detector that's like, let me just verify that. And so I think it's being willing to follow up on that. But I often say to people when they're like, oh, these witnesses, I mean, they're so tough. They are nothing compared to trying to get my 3 children to put their cereal bowls in the dishwasher, to brush their teeth, to actually organize their stuff each morning. And so I just think a lot of that willingness to ask tough questions comes from being a mom and understanding that if we're not leveling with each other, we're not really solving the problem.
But I guess the difference in my mind is the power dynamic is so different. Obviously, with your children, or at least with my children, they know who's boss. And
well, consider yourself lucky, Masu. I mean, my one son has a sign on his door that says, do not enter unless you're Green New Deal. He called me a neoliberal the other day. I mean, my children are tough. They got it from their mom, maybe. So it's true. I mean, look, there is a power dynamic, but the truth is, think about it this way. When someone like Postmaster DeJoy comes in, he is coming as a representative of the Trump administration who's been appointed to do a job. That's the power that he comes with, the power of the agency. I come with the power of all people in the United States, whether they're Democrat or Republican, voting age or not. I am there to question on their behalf. So that I actually have the upper hand. I am the representative of the people. And your job as a government official is to be accountable to the people. And so I think some of that getting intimidated by these witnesses, it's really about understanding the power that you have when you are an elected official. And as my son always says, with great power comes great responsibility, right, Spider Mom? And so he's always reminding me of that, that I have to take on that responsibility to ask those tough questions. I'll also just say it helps to be funny or to be interesting. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how can I break this topic down so that I can engage people in listening to it. And the last thing I'll just say is a lot of my colleagues, they've said to me like, wow, you're so good at questioning. Like, do you have any tips? And the truth is most of them talk for 4 minutes and then they go, do you agree? Well, at that point, with what? I mean, you've been talking for 4 minutes. And so it's very easy for the witness to filibuster. So I really try to start, like with Postmaster DeJoy. My first question to him was, Mr. DeJoy, how much does a postage stamp cost? Right? And so really getting into that questioning right at the beginning, but it takes a lot of, I think, it's risk taking, really, because when you ask them a question, you're putting them back in control. And so I think there's very much that battle for control as you're questioning a witness, but that is not unlike the battle for control that goes on around, Luke, I need you to unload the dishwasher. Well, I wasn't paid my allowance, and I'm opposed to forced labor. And I know you are too, Mom. So I'm not going to be unloading that until you pay up, right? And so I do think, God bless you if you feel like you have all the power over your children. Come help me with mine.
Don't quote me on that. I don't know that that's true anymore, especially with my 15-year-old, but I do have a 5-year-old. And the jury's out on the 12-year-old. Moving forward, I'm looking back at our Yale days. If I remember correctly, while we were undergrads, you weren't in the political union, you weren't a debater, you weren't in the Yale College Council. These are things that are kind of hallmarks of the Yalie who wants to pursue a career in politics. So when in your life and why did you become interested in going into politics?
Yeah, I guess I felt like during college, those organizations were, I don't know, I think about a lot of guys, a lot of white dudes wearing navy blue blazers, accumulating at those events. So it's the khaki pants and navy blue blazer. And also I think that, just like in life, a lot of the people who came to Yale interested in politics were people who had come from privileged backgrounds where they had parents who were donors. They had known elected officials. Sometimes their parents were elected officials. You and I went to college with students whose parents were in office at the time. And so I think in college, I just felt much more drawn to working directly on problems. And so you and I got to know each other through the US grant program, through teaching underserved kids. I did a lot of community service at Yale. I really enjoyed that. But I guess I didn't feel like those institutions were places where I belonged. And I think that is a real problem because some of these institutions, as you say, are useful training grounds for people who are going to be in politics later on. I also think that, people tend to have very preconceived ideas about what prepares you to be an effective elected official. And I think one of the surprising things is, when I talk about things like being a mom has helped me be a better elected official, being a teacher has helped me be a better elected official. I think our understanding of what that skill set is a little bit off. So the skill set that a politician needs isn't the ability to debate or to fast talk or to know at birth what political party they want to be part of. The skill that our elected officials need in this country is the ability to communicate. The ability to communicate clearly with the public, what the problems are, what the possible solutions are, where the roadblocks are to getting there, and to bring the public along in that conversation. And so I think sometimes the skills and things that we think make people good elected officials aren't always what really translates into people being effective at doing the work.
That's really interesting. Okay, so I would like to ask you a very interesting question I think that a lot of people want to know about you. You have been quoted as saying, "I'm not being asked to conform to some prior expectation of what a Congress member is, but I'm just getting to be me." I read this quote and I thought, A, this is so true of you, and B, how is this possible? I remember working with you at US Grant. I remember how outspoken you were. You've never been afraid of ruffling feathers or being loud, which is the opposite, really, of what people traditionally or stereotypically expect a politician to be. I read an August 2020 Elle interview with you when you interrupted the journalist to tell her that you'd stepped in dog poo. I literally laughed out loud, and I thought to myself, that's 100% Katie Porter, and I really don't know of any other politician who would cop to stepping in dog poo in the middle of her Elle interview. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, how and where did you develop the license to do things in Congress your own way? Where does your license to be your own authentic self as a Congresswoman come from? Whether it's, pulling out that whiteboard or wearing the Catwoman suit on Halloween. You seem to
Batgirl.
Batgirl,
Just so
Batgirl. Sorry. But you seem to have sort of struck your own pathway. You're set, that very few other Congresswomen have. Where does that come
Well,
from?
I mean, I think there's two things. As I listened to you and I said, that I've never felt the pressure to conform. I mean, I must have given that quote early in my time in Congress, because I definitely have since felt some pressure to conform. But that's partly because Congress is a body it's a collective body. We only have power partly through taking collective action, through having enough votes. And so things like the hearings are opportunities to exercise some individual influence, to find your own individual voice. I do think Yale was really, really important for me in this regard. So many different kinds of people from so many different walks of life, so many different kinds of ideas about what they wanted to do, about how they wanted to move through the world. I mean, my Yale roommates, remember back when we were at Yale, they had like group 1 courses, group 2 courses, group 3 and group 4. Well, I had 3 roommates, and we each majored in one of the different groups. So like one was an art major and one was a science major, and I was an American Studies major. So I think feeling like it is your uniqueness that is the contribution. And I think that is something that good education should reinforce to people as they're going through it, that what you have to say or your perspective is worth hearing, is worth knowing. And so I think I try to come at it from that standpoint. But I will say, with regard to the sort of, the Elle interview, I mean, definitely was probably voted in college least likely to ever appear in a fashion magazine. I think I wore the same sweatshirt like every day that I was at Yale, and the same pair of like very inexplicably baggy jeans. That said, I mean, I think one of the things that elected officials fall into is this sense of holding themselves separate from the people that they represent. And the truth is, life happens to us too. We have kids who get sick. We have, we're caught in long lines. We have all the same challenges that a lot of Americans face. And I think the more that we acknowledge that, rather than separating ourselves from the American people, the more we're going to be able to have real conversations with them about policy problems. But I will only just say about kind of where I got it is I'll share this childhood story. I'm not sure I've ever told anyone this before, but when I was little, like 2 or 2.5, 3, my parents would say to me, "Not one more word, Catherine." And I would say, "Okay." And I knew what I was doing. Like, I knew I was giving them sass by saying okay, right? Even then. And so I think, it took pretty strong parents, and it took pretty strong educational institutions to sort of shape me. But I'm really grateful for all of those who've tried to corral me, who've taught me along the way, whether by being my friend or in a formal classroom setting.
Well, you have been such a trailblazer in Congress, and I know so many of us appreciate that about you, and really hope to see more people follow your lead in that regard. So we're almost out of time, but I have one last question. You arguably have one of the hardest jobs in the country right now, but it must feel immensely gratifying to know that you spend most days as a Congresswoman fighting the good fight to fix some of our country's hardest problems for some of its most vulnerable populations. What advice would you give to Yale women of our generation who are watching this conference, who want to contribute to fixing some of the problems we've discussed, but don't work in professions where they do so directly? Other than voting and contributing to or helping the campaigns of political candidates whose platforms align with our values, are there any tangible action items you would urge Yale women like me who are hungry for positive change in this country to take in order to help address some of our most pressing problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things about democracy that I think is most difficult for us to grapple with in the wake of the election of Donald Trump is democracy is actually our collective responsibility. A functioning government is not just about me, people in Congress. It's actually about all of you. It's about each one of us doing our part. And so I think people that means that learning about issues, finding ways to get engaged. So whether it's working with a nonprofit, whether it's being vocal about a particular policy issue, whether it's getting engaged at the local level, those are all really meaningful things. I'll also tell you that the number one thing that we need in this country is good ideas to solve hard problems. And so when I was an academic as a professor, I worked on what I hoped and believed were good ideas to help solve problems like the foreclosure crisis. And so I think part of it with democracy is understanding that we all have to be doing something, but giving ourselves permission that that something looks a little bit different for every person, and it looks a little different at different stages of our lives. And so there were times in my career where I could not imagine having undertaken running for office. There were times while I was doing it that I asked myself, why the heck did I undertake this? And there are days when I'm doing the job now that I think to myself, this feels impossible. But that is actually the responsibility, the sort of weight that democracy puts on each one of us. And the question is, how do you pick that weight up and move it forward? And I think that's going to look really different for different people. But I think that that is sort of really key to how we fix things. The problem of rebuilding our government isn't going to go away after the November election. And it doesn't matter who wins. We can elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We can elect Donald Trump. The reality is our country's still going to have some really big problems. Our world is still going to have really big problems. And so I just encourage people to think about how to use their talents, how to use their energy, and to get engaged in these issues and understand that no matter what your career is, no matter what you're doing with your life right now, whether you're retired or just starting your career looking for a job, you have a democratic responsibility. You have a responsibility to this country as someone who loves this country and wants to see it become better, to step up. And then give yourself a lot of freedom to say what that step up looks like. It might be very different for you than for someone else.
Katie, that response was so inspiring, seriously.
Does that mean you're going to run for Congress, Masu?
I am going to step up and provide good solutions to hard problems. That is my goal and the way that I can do it right now. But you really do inspire me, and you inspire so many women and men across this country. But particularly, we're honored to have you among our ranks as a fellow Yale woman. Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. It's always energizing to talk to you. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. It was my pleasure, Katie.
Absolutely.